President Trump's assassination attempt has generated a lot of controversy, and hands down, one of the most perplexing questions is how many shooters were there? Because I remember that in the first couple hours of the event, there were reports that there were 2 shooters. Of course, when we say official reports, we are talking about the same people who claimed that they couldn't secure the roof where the shooter was, because it had slope. Being the Secret Service's counter snipers on a more sloped roof. In other words, these people think we are stupid. And here's an unrelated picture of a cow on a very sloped roof full of manure, which is the perfect description of said official version of events. So I guess that we have to go with the narrative that Thomas Crooks acted alone, bought a 5-foot ladder which was not big enough to reach the rooftop he was in, could fly a drone to scout the area before the attempt, had 0 social media footprint, and of course was conveniently located at a point that was somehow outside of the Secret Service's security bubble. I mean, I want to go with Occam's razor. The simpler explanation is usually the correct one. That this is just the work of one guy that just snapped, and while he was having his breakfast cereal, he thought that it was a lovely day to take out the Orange Man. And at the same time, it's no wonder that we are being pushed this narrative about DEI, which I think it's too easy of a cop-out. That the policies that the Secret Service in regards to hiring personnel tall enough to the task, yes, they absolutely need to take into account height depending on who are they going to protect. Because if we were talking about Kevin Hart or Martin Freeman, well, these ladies from the Secret Service should have no problem doing their job. Although, call me old-fashioned, but I don't think that it should be a woman's job to risk her life protecting a man unless it's her own son. And that would not be her job. That would be a mother's instinct. But that is only my opinion. But don't you tell me that it's very convenient to just blame on mediocrity and incompetence what could be instead attributed to malice. And the malice that we are talking about is that quite a few people have very compelling arguments against this being a lone gunman. But instead, we'll be talking about 2 or maybe 3 of them. The first one is Chris Martinson, PhD. Well, right out of the gate, I have my reservations about people who include their degrees on their names, but I will give him a pass. Martinson, in his video, he makes an analysis of the echo of the bullets, and this is something that I'm familiar with, as in the sound that we hear when Trump was speaking, and you hear those popping sounds, and those popping sounds are double. The first sound that we hear is a zipping of the bullet going right next to the mic. That is, of course, in front of Trump. Now, the bullets fired by an AR-15 rifle are supersonic. They travel faster than the speed of sound. So you first hear that crack of the bullet, and then you hear the actual shot because the sound of the actual shot travels slower than the bullet itself. So that's why you hear 2 sounds. One of the bullet cracking sound right in front of the mic, and then the shot itself. So it's interesting that in the first 3 of them, the time between the crack of the bullet passing right next to the mic and the sound of the actual shot, the delay between both sounds is the same. He mentions that it's 0.22 seconds. But in the later bursts of gunfire, which are around 4 or 5 shots, this delay is different. It's much faster than the first 3 shots. What does this mean? It means that the time between the crack and the actual shot can help you determine what is the distance of the shooter. So if the first 3 shots have the same delay between crack and shot, you can make an educated guess that what was the distance of the shooter. But when you hear the delay of the following burst of shots, that delay is different, which could mean that those were from a different gunman or was located at a different distance than Thomas Crooks. I just want to make it clear that while the theory is compelling because that's how bullets and sound actually work, this is a quite delicate and critical claim because that would mean that the official report of this assassination attempt is not taking into consideration that there could have been a second shooter. And it doesn't help, as the Vigilant Fox says, that we were told Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and Sirhan acted alone and that James Earl Ray acted alone. And at the same time, there's a compelling evidence that it could have been a single shooter like this thread by Oliver Alexander. But before going through that thread, I want to highlight a video made by Azget Industries in which she makes an awesome deconstruction in 3D about all of the shots. I put that link in the description of this video. And especially, how is it possible, and this is critical, that the first shot pierced Trump's ear and at the same time hit David Dutch on the other side at the grandstands on the far side? Or at the end of the bullet's trajectory, which is that tiny smoke burst that we see of the bullet that first pierced President Trump's ear, hit David Dutch, and then hit the guardrail. People are asking, if David Dutch was at the top of that grandstand, we are assuming that he was at a higher position than Trump. Because as you can see in some videos of the back of the stage where Trump was speaking, you see that Trump was not that high above ground level. You see these two pictures side by side, and the one of the left is during the aftermath of the attempt. And you see that the stage in which Trump was standing on has barely 6 steps. It's barely 6 steps tall. But at the same time, when you see a screenshot of David Dutch being helped down the grandstand, you see that maybe he was sitting at a height that was similar to President Trump's ear, because we are seeing way more than 6 steps there. So my question is, if we have video proof that the first shot that pierced Trump's ear and hit David Dutch was the same bullet, how is it possible that the shooter was on a rooftop, which we can agree is at a higher than the height that Trump was giving his speech, then the bullet would have a downward trajectory. If the bullet had a downward trajectory from the rooftop to where Trump was and nicked his ear, how did the bullet end up at the height that David Dutch was? And this was the first question that I asked myself, because it was odd. But there are two possible explanations to this. The first one is that the bullet, after grazing Trump's ear, it could have been bounced in one of the steps and then hit Dutch and then made that sudden burst in the rail. That's a possibility. And the other possible explanation, thanks to Carlos Rosendo, who suggested this, but I don't have a way to confirm it. The ceiling from which the shots were fired was not that high, and furthermore, the base of the building could be lower than the esplanade. Now, since maybe the terrain had a bit of a slope, and the building itself, with the rooftop where Crooks was, maybe it was at a relatively lower height than where Trump was. That would explain it. That is the only way to explain it, in fact. Not to mention that we also have claims of not only people who heard shots coming from different places. And that is important. That was recollection from people who were actually there. But then there are other videos that suggest that there was someone at a nearby water tower. Now, allegedly, the water tower guy was already being discarded, and I can understand why. It would have been too difficult to just escape so fast after taking those shots, and at the same time, the visibility from the water tower to where Trump was not ideal, was blocked. The place where Thomas Crooks was, that was the ideal spot, and I don't like to call it the ideal spot because that's when you realize how many coincidences had to collide for this to happen. Not having any Secret Service agents in that area, not having any law enforcers to check the rooftop, was literally closest to where Trump was going to give his speech. And we have the presence of only counter snipers who had Crooks on their sides for a decent amount of time until they retaliated. Let's imagine for a moment that it was just one guy. And let's go with the official narrative that it was one guy. I have no problem of accepting that narrative. The problem that I have, that if it was indeed one guy, the amount of both coincidences And mediocrity is so overwhelming that this is the reason why so many people claim that crooks must have had help from inside. So let's go with Oliver Alexander's thread, which is the most compelling description and theory that this could have actually be an Occam's razor situation. The simplest description is usually the correct one, and it was just one guy. Stories of footage from the Trump assassination attempt shows that Trump and David Dodge were hit in Crook's initial 3-shot volley. Corey Comparator and James Copenhaver were struck by Crook's follow-up volley a few seconds later. And he posts this video in which the high-resolution version, it can be seen everything at the same time. How the people who were hurt and killed are in the sideline of the fire that nicked President Trump's ear. And how is that possible if we already checked the relative height of everyone involved, I ask? And Oliver includes that the round that impacted the bleacher and the one that hit David Dodge struck at more or less 10 feet, 6 inches of the ground. Trump on the stage would have his head at around 11 feet off the ground, given the height of the stage. And this matches with the trajectory from Crook's location, because Crook's location most probably was not that high, as we guessed beforehand. And the reason why in the original analysis of the audio we see a difference or hear a difference in the delay between the crack of the bullets and the actual shots in the first 3 shots and the 5 shots that follow is that the first 3 shots were closer to the mic and the other 5 shots were way more random. So as many people are saying, this is going to be evaluated in many ways. All the angles, all the possibilities, and all that really happened that day. But again, if these theories are correct and confirm the official version of events, that it was a single shooter, I don't think it makes it any better. I would say that it indeed makes it worse, because that single shooter, in my opinion, must have had some kind of help. Or we were talking about the luckiest guy in the world. But I would like to know what you think about this in the comments. Don't forget to download my 100 body language tips in the description of this video. My name is Jesus Enrique Rosas. I'm the body language guy. Much love and bliss.